The news from the Pacific reached Hitler's headquarters on December 7, 1941, while he was at the Wolfschanze in East Prussia, directing operations against Soviet forces outside Moscow. Japanese aircraft had attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii with devastating effect. The attack had sunk or damaged multiple battleships, including the Arizona, Oklahoma, and California, and destroyed hundreds of aircraft on the ground. American casualties numbered in the thousands, with over 2,400 killed. The Japanese had struck without warning or declaration of war, achieving complete tactical surprise that resulted in devastating damage to the Pacific Fleet, anchored in what Americans had believed was a secure harbor. Hitler's initial reaction was jubilation and excitement about the bold Japanese action. The attack represented exactly the kind of bold, decisive action that he admired in principle and had advocated throughout his political and military career. Japan had struck its enemy with overwhelming force at a carefully chosen moment of vulnerability, achieving results that shifted the strategic balance in the Pacific theater dramatically in Japan's favor. The psychological parallels to Germany's own campaigns of rapid conquest and decisive offensive action were obvious and deeply appealing to Hitler's worldview about the supreme importance of will, surprise, and decisive action in warfare. The immediate tactical implications seemed favorable to Germany from Hitler's perspective. American attention and resources would necessarily shift toward the Pacific theater and the war against Japan. The aid that America had been providing to Britain through the Lend-Lease program would be constrained by American needs to rebuild its shattered Pacific Fleet and prepare for extensive war against Japan across the Pacific. British forces would lose American support or see it significantly diminished just when they needed it most. The coalition opposing Germany would be weakened by American distraction with a Pacific War that had nothing to do with European affairs. Hitler's enthusiasm reflected his consistent underestimation of American industrial capacity and military potential throughout the pre-war years. Throughout the pre-war period and the early years of the European War, Hitler had dismissed America as a mongrel nation weakened by democracy, racial mixing, and what he perceived as Jewish influence corrupting national strength. He believed American society lacked the martial spirit and national cohesion necessary for sustained military effort against determined opponents. The economic depression of the 1930s had confirmed his view that American economic power was exaggerated propaganda and that American capitalism was inherently unstable and vulnerable to crisis. The strategic implications of Japan's attack required more careful consideration than Hitler initially gave them in his enthusiasm for dramatic action. Japan and Germany were not formal military allies with coordinated strategy or shared war aims. The Tripartite Pact of 1940 between Germany, Italy, and Japan created defensive obligations if one signatory was attacked, but it did not require mutual offensive support for aggressive wars. Japan had attacked America without consulting Germany or coordinating strategy with Berlin in any meaningful way. Germany had no treaty obligation to declare war on America in response to Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. Yet Hitler decided within days to declare war on America, despite having absolutely no treaty obligation to do so, and despite the obvious strategic disadvantages. The decision reflected multiple factors operating simultaneously in Hitler's thinking. He believed war with America was inevitable, regardless of when or how it began. American support for Britain through Lend-Lease and American naval actions in the Atlantic had already created an undeclared naval war. Formalizing the state of war would allow German submarines to attack American shipping without restrictions that had limited operations when America was technically neutral. Hitler also believed that declaring war on America would encourage Japan to attack the Soviet Union from the east, creating the two-front war against the Soviets that Germany needed. Japan and the Soviet Union had signed a neutrality pact in April 1941. but Hitler hoped Japanese success against America might embolden Japan to break that pact and attack Soviet Far Eastern territories. A two-front war against the Soviets would relieve pressure on German forces struggling outside Moscow. The assumption that Japan would attack the Soviet Union proved completely wrong. Japan had chosen to strike south against American, British, and Dutch possessions in the Pacific, rather than north against Soviet territory. Japanese strategic priorities focused on securing resources in Southeast Asia, not on continental expansion in Siberia. Hitler's declaration of war on America brought no reciprocal Japanese action against the Soviets. Hitler announced Germany's declaration of war on America on December 11, 1941, in a speech to the Reichstag that combined historical grievances against America with ideological attacks on President Roosevelt and American democracy. The speech characterized America as controlled by Jewish interests that sought Germany's destruction. It portrayed the declaration of war as a necessary response to American provocation and aggression in the Atlantic. The reasoning convinced few observers outside Germany, but it satisfied Hitler's need to frame the decision as justified response rather than strategic choice. The declaration of war transformed the European conflict into a genuinely global war. Britain now had a powerful ally with vast industrial resources committed to fighting Germany. The Soviet Union, already at war with Germany, would benefit from American material support that would grow over time. Germany faced a coalition of enemies whose combined resources far exceeded German capabilities. The strategic mathematics that had always disfavored Germany in prolonged war became overwhelmingly adverse. Hitler's military advisors had mixed reactions to the declaration. Some recognized the strategic disadvantages, but accepted Hitler's argument that war with America was inevitable and that Germany might as well fight on its own terms. Others privately worried that bringing America into the war guaranteed German defeat in any extended conflict. The German General Staff had studied American industrial capacity and understood that American war production, once fully mobilized, would dwarf German output. The timing of the declaration compounded its strategic foolishness. German forces outside Moscow had been stopped by Soviet resistance and winter weather. The Blitzkrieg campaign that was supposed to defeat the Soviet Union in months had failed. Germany was committed to a prolonged war on the Eastern Front against an enemy with vast territory and resources. Adding America to Germany's list of enemies at precisely the moment when German forces were overstretched and unable to achieve decisive victory showed profound strategic miscalculation. Hitler's beliefs about American weakness shaped his decision, but had little basis in reality. American industry had mobilized slowly during the 1930s, but retained enormous productive capacity that would expand dramatically once mobilized for war. American population exceeded Germany's and included industrial workforce that could be rapidly trained and deployed. American geography protected its industry from enemy attack, while American resources in raw materials exceeded Germany's access even with conquered territories. The American response to Pearl Harbor demonstrated national unity and determination that contradicted Hitler's assumptions about American weakness and division. Congress declared war on Japan with only one dissenting vote. American industry began conversion to war production immediately. The isolationist sentiment that had kept America out of the European war evaporated in the wake of Pearl Harbor. Hitler had assumed American society would fracture under pressure. Instead, it unified. Hitler's declaration of war on America solved a difficult political problem for President Roosevelt. American public opinion supported war against Japan after Pearl Harbor, but remained divided about entering the European war against Germany. Hitler's declaration eliminated the need for Roosevelt to persuade Congress and the public to fight in Europe. Germany had declared war on America, making American participation in the European theater a matter of national defense rather than foreign intervention. The strategic advantages that Hitler imagined from declaring war failed to materialize. German submarines did gain freedom to attack American shipping in the Atlantic, and they achieved significant successes in early 1942 against unprepared American coastal defenses. But American industrial capacity produced merchant ships faster than submarines could sink them, and American anti-submarine warfare improved rapidly. The submarine campaign that Hitler hoped would strangle Britain and isolate America failed to achieve strategic results. Japan did not attack the Soviet Union despite German hopes and encouragement. Japanese forces advanced through Southeast Asia and the Pacific, but they directed no operations against Soviet territory. The two-front war against the Soviets that Hitler needed never developed. Soviet forces defending the Far East could be redeployed to fight Germans without fear of Japanese attack. The strategic coordination between Germany and Japan that Hitler assumed would develop from mutual war against common enemies never occurred. American entry into the war transformed Allied strategic options and resource availability. Britain received increasing American aid and gained confidence that the war could be won with American support. The Soviet Union benefited from American Lend-Lease supplies that provided trucks, aircraft, raw materials, and food that sustained Soviet forces. The combined industrial capacity of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union overwhelmed Germany's ability to compete in sustained war production. Hitler's reaction to American mobilization showed continued delusion about American capabilities. He dismissed American industrial production figures as propaganda and exaggeration. He insisted that American soldiers would prove inferior to German troops in combat. He maintained that American democracy would crack under the pressure of casualties and that American public would demand peace once the costs of war became apparent. None of these beliefs had factual basis, but they allowed Hitler to avoid confronting the strategic impossibility of defeating the coalition he had helped create. The declaration of war on America represented one of Hitler's most consequential strategic decisions and one of his greatest blunders. Germany had no obligation to declare war. German's strategic situation would have been better served by remaining technically at peace with America while Japan fought in the Pacific. The decision to declare war brought America fully into the European conflict with all its industrial and military power committed to Germany's defeat. The decision reflected Hitler's consistent pattern of making strategic choices based on ideological conviction and personal psychology, rather than objective assessment of capabilities and interests. He believed in the power of will to overcome material disadvantages. He assumed enemies would prove weak when confronted with decisive action. He trusted his instincts over professional military analysis. These tendencies had served him well in the 1930s, when opponents backed down from confrontation. They proved catastrophic when applied to global war against coalition of powers with superior resources. Within weeks of declaring war on America, German forces began retreat from Moscow, marking the failure of Operation Barbarossa and the beginning of prolonged war in the East that Germany could not win. American industry began mobilizing for war production that would eventually exceed all Axis powers combined. British forces gained confidence that American entry guaranteed eventual victory. The strategic situation that Hitler had created by declaring war on America ensured German defeat, barring collapse of the Allied coalition or miraculous German technological breakthrough, neither of which occurred. Hitler learned of Pearl Harbor with joy and declared war on America with confidence that the decision served German interests. The decision instead guaranteed German defeat by uniting against Germany a coalition of powers whose combined resources Germany could not match. The declaration of war on December 11, 1941, stands as one of history's clearest examples of strategic decision made on ideological grounds despite obvious material disadvantages, and it contributed decisively to the outcome that destroyed Nazi Germany and ended Hitler's vision of German domination in Europe. The news from Pearl Harbor reached Hitler as tactical success for Germany's ally. Hitler's declaration of war transformed it into strategic catastrophe for Germany. The enthusiasm with which Hitler greeted Japanese attack and the confidence with which he declared war on America demonstrated the combination of ideological blindness and strategic incompetence that characterized Nazi leadership. Hitler learned that America had entered the war, but he never understood what that meant for Germany's chances of victory or survival. The learning occurred on December 7, 1941. The understanding never came.